July 12, 1943, 5:47 a.m., 3 kilometers south of Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. The smell hit Sergeant Yuri Sokolov before anything else: hot metal, diesel fumes, and the acrid stench of cordite already drifting across the wheat fields from artillery strikes that had started before dawn. Inside the driver's compartment of T-34 tank number 2319, Yuri's hands rested on the twin steering levers, his knees pressed against cold steel, his world reduced to a rectangular slit of vision 6 inches wide and 2 inches tall. Through that narrow window, he watched the sun bleeding orange across the horizon, illuminating a landscape that would soon become the largest tank battle in human history. His breath came shallow in the confined space. The engine behind him ticked as it cooled from the pre-dawn engine checks, and somewhere above his head, beyond the armored wall that separated him from the turret crew, he could hear Lieutenant Grigory Petrov's voice, muffled and distant, speaking to the loader and gunner. Then came the sound that would define the rest of his life, the sharp rap of metal on metal, rhythmic and purposeful, and the hiss of an acetylene torch being lit just outside his hatch. They were welding him in. If you're captivated by stories of courage under unimaginable circumstances, subscribe now, because what happens next will haunt you forever. The Soviet military's practice of welding tank drivers into their compartments emerged not from sadism, but from brutal pragmatic mathematics developed during the desperate defense of Moscow and Stalingrad. Soviet command had identified a critical vulnerability in their armored doctrine. Under intense German fire, T-34 drivers would abandon their positions, leaving operational tanks immobilized on the battlefield. The statistics were damning. Between November 1941 and March 1942, the Red Army lost approximately 1,847 tanks to abandonment, tanks that still had functioning engines, ammunition, and guns, but no crews willing to remain inside them when German Panzer shells started finding their range. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, reviewing these losses with Stalin in April 1942, had been characteristically blunt. The weak link is always the driver. He sits alone, separated from his comrades, with no view of the battle. When panic strikes, he opens his hatch and runs. One coward immobilizes 5 brave men. The solution was implemented quietly, without written orders, passed down through the command structure as recommended battlefield procedure. Before major engagements, tank commanders were authorized to have their drivers' hatches welded or bolted shut from the outside. The driver would enter his compartment, settle into a seat, and then listen as his only escape route was sealed. The practice was never universal, never officially acknowledged, and never recorded in any document that survived the Soviet archives' purges. But it happened, thousands of times, to thousands of men. Yuri Sokolov had known it was coming. Lieutenant Petrov had informed the crew the night before, his voice flat and emotionless in the darkness of their bivouac position. Tomorrow will be the decisive battle. We cannot afford mechanical failures, and we cannot afford hesitation. Sokolov, your hatch will be sealed before we advance. This is not punishment. This is necessity. You are the best driver in the battalion, and I need to know you will be at the controls no matter what happens. The other crew members had said nothing. What was there to say? They all knew men who had been welded in before. Some had survived. Some had died in ways that made death in combat seem merciful by comparison. Gunner Ivan Morozov had offered Yuri his flask of Samagon vodka that evening. Drink deep, brother. Tomorrow you drive us to victory or to hell. Either way, you will not leave your seat. Yuri had declined. He wanted his hands steady and his mind clear. He was 23 years old, a tractor driver from a collective farm outside Kursk before the war. He understood machines intimately, loved the T-34's temperamental clutch, and the precise technique required to shift gears smoothly. He had survived 11 months of combat, from the winter counteroffensive at Moscow through the grinding urban warfare at Stalingrad. He had driven his tank through German infantry positions, across minefields, through burning villages. He had never abandoned his post, never considered it. Yet now, as the torch flared outside his hatch and he heard the sputter of welding rod meeting steel, something primitive screamed inside his chest. Every instinct demanded he push the hatch open, climb out, run. But he remained still, hands on the levers, breathing slowly through his nose. The welding took 4 minutes. Yuri counted each second. When it finished, he reached up and pushed gently against the hatch. It didn't move. The seal was complete. He was entombed in a steel coffin on wheels, with only the narrow vision slit to connect him to the world outside. Lieutenant Petrov's voice crackled through the intercom, tinny and distorted. "Driver, confirm. Communications check." "Driver confirms," Yuri responded, his voice steadier than he felt. "Communications operational." "Good man. Engine start in 3 minutes. Today we stop the fascist offensive. Today we break their panzers. Today is glorious." There was nothing glorious about the compartment Yuri occupied. The T-34's driver sat in a cramped cell barely 5 feet wide, surrounded by mechanical components, ammunition storage, and fuel tanks. The transmission housing occupied the center of the compartment, with the steering levers mounted on either side. Above his head, the Hull machine gun protruded, though he had no ability to fire it while driving. That was the bow gunner's responsibility, and the Red Army had eliminated the bow gunner position in the T-34 to increase ammunition storage, leaving Yuri alone in the forward hull. The engine compartment was directly behind him, separated by a thin steel firewall that did almost nothing to insulate against heat or noise. When the V2 diesel engine ran at combat power, the temperature in Yuri's compartment could reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was physically painful, a roaring mechanical thunder that made communication impossible without the intercom. And in front of him, barely 18 inches from his face, were fuel tanks. 61 gallons of diesel on the left, 61 on the right. If penetrated by shell fragments or incendiary rounds, those tanks would transform his compartment into a crematorium in seconds. At 5:52 a.m., the order came. "All tanks, start engines, prepare to advance." Yuri pressed the starter button. The V2 diesel turned over once, twice, then caught with a rattling roar that vibrated through every bone in his body. He let it warm for 30 seconds, checking oil pressure and temperature gauges by the dim light of the instrument panel. Everything was within acceptable parameters. The T-34 carried 120 rounds of 76mm ammunition, 2,400 rounds of machine gun bullets, 5 men, and 75 gallons of diesel fuel. Total combat weight 26.8 tons. All of it depending on Yuri's ability to maneuver across terrain at speeds up to 35 miles per hour, while German anti-tank guns, panzers, and Stukas tried to kill him. "All tanks, advance. Maintain formation. For the motherland, for Stalin." The T-34 lurched forward as Yuri released the clutch. The transmission was a 4-speed crash box, no synchronizers, requiring precise double clutching to avoid grinding gears. After 11 months, Yuri could shift without thinking, his hands and feet moving in practice coordination. The tank accelerated across the wheat field, the ride harsh and jarring despite the Christie suspension that had made the T-34 legendary for its cross-country speed. Through his narrow vision slit, Yuri could see perhaps 30 degrees of the landscape ahead. Everything else was blind. He navigated partly by sight, partly by Lieutenant Petrov's directions through the intercom, and partly by instinct developed through months of combat. The column consisted of 62 T-34 tanks from the 181st Tank Brigade, advancing in a wedge formation toward German positions 3 kilometers south. Intelligence had reported elements of the SS Panzer Corps Das Reich holding defensive positions along the Selle River. What intelligence had failed to report accurately was that Das Reich had been reinforced overnight by 42 Tiger tanks and 35 Panthers from reserve formations. At 6:03 a.m., German artillery found them. The first shell impacted 80 yards to Yuri's left, throwing up a fountain of dirt and smoke. Then the world became chaos. Shells began falling in systematic patterns, walking across the wheat field in lines of destruction. Yuri felt the concussions through the tank's hull, each impact like a hammer blow against his chest. "Driver, increase speed, zigzag pattern, move." Lieutenant Petrov's voice was sharp with urgency. Yuri pushed the throttle forward, the diesel howling as the T-34 accelerated to nearly 30 miles per hour. He began weaving left and right in irregular patterns, trying to throw off German artillery calculations. The visibility through his slit was almost useless now. Dust and smoke obscured everything beyond 20 yards. A T-34 to his right took a direct hit. Yuri saw it only as a flash in his peripheral vision, but he heard the explosion clearly even over his own engine. The intercom carried Lieutenant Petrov's calm observation. Tank 47 destroyed. Continue advance. The temperature in Yuri's compartment was already climbing. The morning was warm, the engine was at combat power, and adrenaline was flooding his system. Sweat soaked his uniform, stinging his eyes. He wanted desperately to reach up and wipe his face, but he couldn't take his hands off the controls. The German defensive line appeared suddenly through the smoke. Earthworks, camouflage positions, and the angular shapes of PaK-40 anti-tank guns. Muzzle flashes flickered along the line as German gunners opened fire at nearly point-blank range. "Gunner, target, anti-tank gun, 11 o'clock, fire!" The T-34's 76mm gun roared, the concussion hammering through the hull. Yuri couldn't see the result. His vision was fixed forward, focused on not driving into a shell crater or anti-tank ditch. "Hit! Reload! Driver, bear left, left! More!" Yuri hauled on the left steering lever, feeling the transmission protest as the tank slewed sideways at full speed. A German shell passed through the space they had occupied 1 second earlier. The battle became a hellish blur. Yuri drove on instinct and orders, maneuvering between obstacles he could barely see. While above him, the gun fired again and again, and machine guns chattered, and metal fragments rang against the hull like deadly hail. At 6:14 a.m., they penetrated the German first line and broke into open terrain beyond. Yuri could see German infantry fleeing their positions, and beyond them, perhaps 800 yards distant, the shapes he had been trained to fear most. Tigers. Their hulls were massive, their guns were enormous, and they were turning to face the Soviet attack. "All tanks, engage enemy armor. Spread out, close the range." Closing the range was essential. The T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor only at ranges under 500 yards, and only if the shot hit perfectly perpendicular to the armor plate. The Tiger's 88mm gun could kill a T-34 from 2,000 yards, from any angle, through any part of the hull or turret. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Speed and numbers were the T-34's only advantages. Yuri pushed the throttle to its limit, the diesel screaming. The suspension hammered as the tank bounced across rough ground at nearly 35 miles per hour. Through his vision slit, he watched the Tigers growing larger, their guns beginning to fire. The first Tiger shell hit a T-34 200 yards to Yuri's left. The Soviet tank simply exploded, turret blown 20 feet into the air, hull rupturing as ammunition cooked off. The second shell hit another tank and another. The Tigers were firing with mechanical precision, each shot a kill. "Driver, evasive maneuvers, do not stop moving." Yuri was already weaving, changing speed and direction every few seconds. A Tiger shell passed so close he felt a shockwave through the hull. Another shell impacted the ground 10 feet ahead, showering the tank with dirt and shrapnel. The distance closed. 600 yards, 500. The T-34's gun fired continuously now, the loader working with desperate speed to keep shells feeding into the breach. Yuri had no idea if they were hitting anything. His entire world was the narrow slit of vision, the steering levers under his hands, and the mechanical feedback of the transmission. 400 yards, 350. Then Lieutenant Petrov's voice, triumphant. "Hit! We got one! The Tiger on the right is burning! Driver, keep—" The world ended. The impact came from the right side, slightly behind Yuri's position. Later, ballistic analysis would determine it was an 88mm armor-piercing shell from a Tiger positioned at a 40-degree angle to their advance. The shell penetrated the T-34's right side armor at the turret ring, passed through the fighting compartment, and exited through the left side without detonating. It killed gunner Ivan Morozov instantly, taking his head and right shoulder off in a spray of bone and metal fragments. It severed loader Dmitry Petrov's left arm at the elbow and drove steel splinters through his torso. It wounded Lieutenant Grigory Petrov across the back and legs with secondary fragments, and it ignited ammunition. The T-34 carried its main gun ammunition in racks around the turret interior, 29 rounds in immediate storage, the rest in floor compartments. When the German shell passed through the fighting compartment, its kinetic energy was sufficient to detonate at least 3 76mm high-explosive shells. The explosion was catastrophic. The pressure wave hammered through the turret interior, rupturing fuel lines and hydraulic systems. Burning propellant in white-hot metal fragments ignited everything combustible: uniforms, leather equipment, stored fuel, grease, paint. In less than 2 seconds, the turret interior became a furnace. Yuri heard the initial impact as a metallic clang that seemed to compress his entire body. Then came the explosion, a hollow boom that resonated through the whole structure. Then came the screaming. Lieutenant Petrov's voice on the intercom was inhuman, a sustained shriek of agony beyond words. Behind it, Yuri could hear other sounds: flames crackling, ammunition beginning to cook off in popping bursts, and something worse: the sound of human bodies burning. "Get out! Get out! Oh God, get out!" Petrov's voice was barely recognizable, stripped down to pure animal terror. Yuri's hands moved automatically to the hatch release above his head. His fingers found the lever, pulled. Nothing happened. The hatch was welded shut. He pulled harder, panic beginning to override training. The metal didn't move, couldn't move. He was sealed inside. "I can't!" Yuri screamed into the intercom. "I can't! The hatch is welded!" The screaming in the turret reached a crescendo, then suddenly cut off from Lieutenant Petrov. The silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been, but the other sounds continued. The roar of flames, the steady popping of small arms ammunition cooking off, and a new sound, wet and horrible, that Yuri's mind refused to identify. The temperature in his compartment was rising rapidly. The firewall between the driver's position and the turret was thin steel, never designed to insulate against the kind of inferno now raging 6 inches behind Yuri's head. He could feel the heat through the metal, could smell paint beginning to smoke on his side of the wall. And the smell, God, the smell: burning diesel, burning rubber, burning electrical insulation. And underneath it all, unmistakable and overwhelming, burning flesh. Human fat and muscle and bone carbonizing at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, producing a stench that would be permanently etched into Yuri's olfactory memory, a smell that would haunt him in random moments for whatever remained of his life. The tank was still moving. In his panic, Yuri had released the clutch and the T-34 was coasting forward, beginning to turn right as the steering naturally drifted. Some part of his brain, the part trained through 11 months of combat, recognized that a stopped tank was a dead tank. His hands found the controls again. He straightened the steering, pressed the throttle. The diesel responded, still functioning despite the hell burning 18 inches behind the engine compartment. The intercom crackled. A voice, so distorted by pain and damage that Yuri almost didn't recognize it as human, whispered, "Drive. Just drive. Get us home." Then nothing. Just the flames and the smoke and the heat and that unspeakable smell. Yuri drove, through vision blurred by tears and sweat, with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the levers. With the screams of dying men echoing in his skull, he drove. German shells continued to fall around him. He no longer attempted evasive maneuvers. He simply pointed the T-34 north, towards Soviet lines, and pushed the throttle forward. The tank became his entire universe. He couldn't see more than 50 yards through the smoke and dust. He had no idea where he was, no communication with command, no way to know if he was even heading in the right direction. The heat behind him grew worse. The firewall was glowing dull red in spots. Paint on the transmission housing began to bubble and char. The instrument panel lights flickered and died as electrical systems failed. But the engine kept running, and the transmission kept responding to his inputs, and the T-34 kept moving. At some point, he crossed no man's land. German fire slackened, then stopped. He realized dimly that he must have outdistanced their anti-tank guns. The terrain began to look familiar. A destroyed farmhouse he remembered from the approach march, a shell crater where a supply truck had been hit the day before. Soviet lines were close. The T-34 began to lose power. The engine note changed, became rough and uneven. The temperature gauge, one of the few instruments still functioning, showed the engine was overheating critically. Yuri eased the throttle back, nursing the dying machine forward. 200 yards, 100. He could see Soviet positions now, infantry, in slit trenches staring in shock at the approaching tank. Smoke poured from every hatch and seam. The entire vehicle was scorched black. It looked like a steel coffin pulled from a crematorium furnace. 50 yards. The engine seized with a final grinding shudder. The T-34 coasted to a stop 30 yards from Soviet lines, settling slightly forward as the transmission locked up. Yuri sat in the driver's seat, hands still on the steering levers, unable to move. Around him, he could hear voices shouting, boots running, someone hammering on the hull. "There's a survivor. The driver is still alive. Get cutting torches. Medics!" The cutting took 40 minutes. The welds that had sealed Yuri's hatch in 5 minutes required nearly an hour to remove, because the welders had to work carefully, terrified of cutting too deep and injuring the man inside. Yuri sat through it all in a state beyond thought. Time had lost meaning, reality had narrowed to the sensory, the heat still radiating from the firewall, the smell that filled his compartment like something physical and tangible. The mechanical vibration of the cutting torch transmitted through the hull structure. When the hatch finally opened and hands reached down to pull him out, he fought them. Not consciously, but with animal instinct. The compartment was horrible, but it was known. The world outside was unknown, too bright, too loud, too full of the implications of what had happened. They pulled him out anyway, lifting his body through the hatch and lowering him to the ground. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Someone else tried to give him water, but his hands shook too badly to hold the canteen. A medical officer checked him for injuries, found none, not a scratch. His uniform wasn't even singed. Physically, Yuri Sokolov was completely unharmed. A young lieutenant from the recovery brigade approached cautiously, his face pale. "Comrade Sergeant, we need to, that is, the recovery crew must examine the tank. Assess if it can be salvaged. Can you tell us what happened?" Yuri's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, forced words past his throat. "The turret. Don't look in the turret. We have to examine the entire vehicle, Comrade Sergeant. I understand it's difficult, but don't look in the turret." The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded to two soldiers. They climbed onto the T-34's hull and opened the turret hatch. The first soldier looked down into the turret compartment for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he turned, stumbled to the edge of the hull, and vomited violently. The second soldier looked, went white as paper, and simply sat down hard on the turret roof, hands covering his face. The lieutenant climbed up, looked inside, and when he climbed down, his hands were shaking. He approached Yuri, and his voice was very quiet. "Comrade Sergeant, you drove this tank back to our lines. You drove it for how long?" "I don't know, 40 minutes, maybe an hour." "You drove it for 47 minutes. We tracked your vehicle from observation positions. 47 minutes from when you were hit until you reached our lines." The lieutenant paused, seemed to struggle with words. "Comrade Sergeant, those men in the turret, they died in the first 60 seconds. No one could have survived longer. You drove for 46 minutes after they were already dead. You could have stopped. You could have waited for recovery forces. But you drove. You brought the tank home." Yuri said nothing. What was there to say? The political officer arrived 2 hours later, accompanied by an NKVD security detachment. The destruction of a tank during combat was always investigated. The survival of only the driver, whose hatch had been welded shut, required special scrutiny. The interrogation took place in a medical tent, with Yuri sitting on a field cot, still wrapped in the blanket, staring at nothing. The political officer, a major with cold eyes and a Kiev accent, asked questions in a mechanical sequence. "Why did you survive when your entire crew died?" "I don't know, Comrade Major. The shell hit the turret. I was in the driver's compartment." "Why didn't you stop when the crew was killed?" "Why continue operating the vehicle?" "I was ordered to drive. I drove." "Did you attempt to assist the crew?" "My hatch was welded. I couldn't reach them." "Did the crew express anti-Soviet sentiments during the battle? Did they display cowardice?" "No, Comrade Major. They fought bravely. They died at their posts." "Why did you not stop the vehicle and await relief?" Yuri finally looked directly at the major. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Because a stopped tank is a dead tank. They trained us, never stopped moving in combat. I was following training." The major studied him for a long moment, then made a note in his report book. Very well. Your actions are consistent with military doctrine. You will be reassigned to a new crew immediately. The motherland needs experienced drivers. We are short of T-34s, but even shorter of trained personnel who can operate them effectively. I can't, Yuri heard himself say. I need to request relief from combat duty. There is no relief from combat at duty, Comrade Sergeant. We are engaged in the great patriotic war against fascist aggression. Every Soviet citizen serves until victory or death. You are physically uninjured. You will return to duty. That night, they gave Yuri a new tank, T-34 number 2357, freshly delivered from the Ural factories, still smelling of paint and grease. The crew was entirely new. None of them had more than 3 weeks of combat experience. The tank commander, a lieutenant barely 20 years old, asked hesitantly if Yuri wanted them to weld his hatch before the next day's operations. Yuri looked at the young officer for a long time. Then very quietly he said, "If you try to weld that hatch, I will kill you. Then I will kill myself. Then I will burn this tank to the ground. Do you understand?" The lieutenant understood. July 13th, 1943, 5:45 a.m. Yuri climbed into the driver's compartment of his new tank. Around him, engines were starting for another day of battle. He settled into the seat, hands on the familiar steering levers, and waited for the order to advance. His hands didn't shake. His breathing was steady. To any observer, he appeared to be a combat-hardened veteran, calm and competent. But inside his mind, behind his eyes where no political officer could see, Yuri Sokolov had ceased to exist. The man who had driven tractors on a collective farm, who had kissed a girl named Katya on a summer evening in 1940, who had dreamed of studying engineering after the war. That man had died in the driver's compartment of T-34, number 2319, during 47 minutes of hell. What remained was something else, something harder and emptier and broken in ways that would never heal. For the next 2 years, Yuri Sokolov fought across Eastern Europe. He drove T-34s through the battles of Kharkov, Dnieper, Lvov, and Warsaw. He trained 15 different crews, watched 11 of them die. He accumulated decorations, the Order of the Red Star, the Order of Glory 3rd Class, campaign medals that meant nothing. He never spoke about July 12, 1943, never mentioned the tank that brought him home, never acknowledged the screams that played in his mind every time he closed his eyes. Other soldiers whispered about him. Sokolov? He's been killed 3 times but hasn't figured it out yet. I heard he drove a burning tank for an hour with his dead crew inside. Something's wrong with that one. You can see it in his eyes. He looks at you, but he's not really seeing you. He's seeing something else, something from before. After the war, Yuri returned to his village. Katya had married someone else. His parents were dead, killed in the German occupation. The collective farm was destroyed, slowly being rebuilt by survivors and soldiers returning from the front. They offered Yuri work as a mechanic. He refused. They offered him a position as a tractor driver. He refused. The local party secretary, concerned about a decorated veteran failing to reintegrate, visited personally. "Comrade Sokolov, you served the motherland with distinction. Now the motherland needs you to serve in peace. The harvest must be brought in. Equipment must be maintained. We need your skills." Yuri looked at the party secretary with eyes that had seen things the bureaucrat couldn't imagine. "I will not sit in a driver's seat again. I will not be enclosed. I will not." He stopped, unable to articulate what he meant. "What will you do?" Yuri shrugged. "I'll find work, manual labor, something outside." He did find work, eventually. Construction sites rebuilding Soviet cities, roads, bridges, jobs that kept him outdoors, that never required him to enter enclosed spaces, that let him run if something inside his mind started screaming. He never married, kept no close friends, lived in a single room in a communal apartment, speaking to neighbors only when necessary. At night he drank, not for pleasure but medicinally, seeking the oblivion where memories couldn't reach. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. On bad nights, he would wake from nightmares, not seeing but smelling. That smell of burning flesh and diesel and paint, as vivid and overwhelming as it had been in July 1943. He would stumble outside, regardless of weather, and stand in the street breathing cold air until his body stopped shaking. In 1953, when Stalin died, some veterans began speaking more openly about their war experiences. Not officially, never officially, but in quiet conversations over vodka, men who had survived the war would share stories that never appeared in official histories. Yuri listened to these stories but never contributed his own. What was there to say? How could he explain to men who had been shot, shelled, and stabbed what it meant to sit uninjured in a driver's seat while 3 men burned to death 6 inches away? How could he make them understand that the worst wounds weren't always physical? In 1967, a young journalist working on a historical project about the Battle of Kursk somehow obtained Yuri's name from military records. She appeared at his apartment, enthusiastic and earnest, with a notebook and questions about the largest tank battle in history. Comrade Sokolov, records indicate you participated in the fighting on July 12, 1943, during the critical phase of the battle. Can you describe your experiences? The heroism of Soviet tankers deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Yuri stood in his doorway, blocking her entrance, looking at this young woman who had been born after the war, who understood history only as dates and statistics. I have nothing to say. But surely you remember. I remember everything. That's the problem. I will never forget. Not one second, not one smell, not one sound. And I will not share it. Not with you, not with anyone. Go away. He closed the door in her face. Some memories weren't meant to be shared. Some experiences couldn't be translated into words that civilians could understand. Some wounds didn't heal, didn't form scar tissue, didn't fade with time. Yuri Sokolov died in 1974 at age 54 from liver failure brought on by decades of heavy drinking. He was buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of Kursk, his grave marked with a simple stone that listed his name, dates, and veteran of the Great Patriotic War. No mention of decorations, no description of service, just the bare facts, which was exactly how Yuri would have wanted it. But the story didn't end with his death. In the late 1980s, during Gorbachev's glasnost period, Soviet military historians began investigating previously classified aspects of the war. A researcher named Pavel Gromov, working through NKVD archives that had been sealed for decades, discovered interrogation reports from the Battle of Kursk. One report, dated July 12, 1943, concerned the destruction of T-34 tank number 2319. The report included technical details about the tank's damage, statements from the recovery crew, and a single photograph. The photograph, grainy and poorly preserved, showed the interior of the T-34's turret after recovery forces had opened it. The image was so disturbing that it had been classified immediately, deemed unsuitable for any purpose other than technical analysis. What the recovery crew had found defied description in official language. The 3 men in the turret, Lieutenant Petrov, Gunner Morozov, and Loader Petrov, had been essentially fused together by the heat. Their remains were carbonized, melted into the metal structure of the turret itself. Ammunition had cooked off intermittently for the 47 minutes that Yuri drove the tank, meaning the bodies had been subjected to repeated explosive trauma while burning. The temperature inside the turret, estimated by metallurgical analysis of the damage, had reached approximately 1,800 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, human tissue doesn't just burn, it undergoes chemical decomposition, with body fats liquefying and then igniting, creating a self-sustaining fire that continues until all organic material is consumed. The metal components of the turret, gun breech, shells casings, equipment mounts, had been partially melted. The paint had been completely vaporized. The rubber eyepiece on the gunner's sight had left a residue that suggested temperatures exceeding normal combustion ranges. And through it all, separated by an 18-inch firewall, Yuri Sokolov had sat in the driver's compartment. The investigation determined that the firewall had protected him from direct flame exposure, but not from the heat, the smoke, or the sounds. The metal wall had conducted heat efficiently. Investigators found that the temperature in the driver's compartment had likely reached 130–140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe discomfort, but not injury. The smoke had been forced through small gaps and ventilation holes, filling his compartment with toxic fumes that Yuri had breathed for 47 minutes. And the sounds, the report noted clinically that the firewall would have provided minimal sound insulation. The driver would have heard everything: the initial explosion, the screaming, the sounds of ammunition cooking off, the crackling of flames consuming organic material. The psychological impact was deemed incalculable. The NKVD investigator who had interrogated Yuri in 1943 had written a final assessment. Subject displays symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma. Recommend relief from combat duty and psychiatric evaluation. That recommendation had been overruled by the political officer who wrote, "Driver is physically capable. Psychological complaints are signs of insufficient revolutionary consciousness. Subject will return to combat duty immediately." Pavel Gromov, reading these documents in 1987, felt physically ill. He had served in Afghanistan, had seen combat, considered himself familiar with war's horrors. But this was something beyond normal combat trauma. This was systematic brutality dressed up as military necessity. The practice of welding drivers into their compartments had never been officially sanctioned, but it had been widely implemented. Gromov's research suggested that between 1942 and 1945, somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 Soviet tank drivers had been sealed into their positions before major battles. Most survived physically. The psychological survival rate was much lower. He tried to find Yuri Sokolov, hoping to interview him for his research. He discovered that Yuri had died 13 years earlier, taking his story with him. But Gromov did find other veterans who had been welded into tanks. Their stories were remarkably consistent, describing the panic when they first realized they couldn't escape, the claustrophobia that never entirely disappeared, even decades later, the nightmares about being trapped while fire spread closer. Several veterans admitted to avoiding enclosed spaces for the rest of their lives, refusing to ride in elevators, fleeing from rooms without windows, sleeping only in rooms with multiple exits clearly visible. One veteran, Mikhail Volkov, who had been welded into his tank during the defense of Stalingrad, told Gromov, "They thought they were making us braver, forcing us to fight because we couldn't run. But they were wrong. They were making us understand that our own commanders valued us less than the machines we drove. They were teaching us that we were expendable, that our fear and our humanity meant nothing compared to tactical objectives." Some men became fatalistic. If we're going to die anyway, might as well die fighting. Other men like me survived but were never the same. We learned that we were alone, completely, utterly alone. No one was coming to save us. No one cared if we lived or died, as long as the tank kept moving. The most damning evidence Gromov found was a technical study conducted by Soviet military engineers in 1944. The study analyzed the effectiveness of welding drivers into their compartments and reached a conclusion that was classified immediately and buried in archives. The practice had no positive effect on combat performance. Tanks with welded drivers showed no improvement in operational time, no decrease in abandonment rates, and no increase in successful mission completion compared to tanks where drivers could exit freely. The reason was psychological. Drivers who felt trapped became overly cautious, reducing their tactical effectiveness. Drivers who knew they couldn't escape made conservative decisions, avoiding risks that might have led to tactical success. And in cases where the tank was seriously damaged, welded drivers often froze, paralyzed by the impossibility of their situation. The study recommended immediately discontinuing the practice. The recommendation was ignored, not because it was ineffective, but because admitting it was ineffective would require acknowledging that thousands of soldiers had been psychologically tortured for no purpose. Better to let the practice continue quietly and blame individual commanders for implementing it. Gromov's research was published in 1989 during the brief window when Soviet authorities permitted honest examination of wartime practices. The article appeared in a military history journal with limited circulation, caused a brief scandal, and then disappeared as the Soviet Union collapsed and other crises demanded attention. But it preserved, in dry academic language, the truth about what had been done to men like Yuri Sokolov. Today, the T-34 is celebrated as one of history's most successful tanks, simple, reliable, produced in quantities that overwhelm German industry. Museums display restored examples. Military historians analyze its tactical impact. Veterans organizations honor the men who crewed them. Rarely mentioned is the human cost of that success, the cramped conditions, The poor visibility, the inadequate armor, the tendency to catch fire when penetrated, and the calculated decision to trap drivers inside machines that could become crematoriums in seconds. Yuri Sokolov's story is not unique. It's not even unusual. It's simply one example among thousands of the price paid by ordinary men for decisions made by commanders who never had to sit in a welded-shut compartment, smelling their friends burn, and keep driving. The Battle of Kursk ended in Soviet victory. The German offensive was blunted, reversed, and turned into a catastrophic retreat. Military historians consider it the decisive turning point on the Eastern Front, the moment when German offensive capability was broken permanently. The battle cost the Red Army approximately 860,000 casualties and 6,000 tanks destroyed or disabled. Among those thousands of disabled tanks was T-34 number 2319, which was never returned to service. The tank was too damaged, the turret too contaminated with the human remains that had been fused into the metal structure. Recovery crews stripped useful components, the engine, transmission, and road wheels, and abandoned the hull in a salvage yard outside Kursk. The hull remained there for decades, slowly rusting, gradually buried by debris and vegetation. In 1973, a year before Yuri Sokolov's death, a team of workers clearing the salvage yard for urban development unearthed the hull. No one recognized what it was initially, just another piece of wartime scrap metal. But when they cut into the turret to extract metal for recycling, they discovered something that made even hardened workers stop. Fused into the metal, still visible after 30 years, were organic residues, enough to identify what had happened there. The workers covered the hull back up and moved it to a remote corner of the salvage yard. No one wanted to deal with the implications. Some tanks are not meant to be remembered. Some sacrifices are too dark to commemorate. Some stories, no matter how true, are incompatible with the heroic narratives that nations prefer to tell about their wars. Yuri Sokolov drove a burning tank for 47 minutes while his crew died screaming inches behind his head, then drove for 2 more years, then drank himself to death over 2 more decades because his country valued the tank more than the man. His story is true. It happened to thousands of men, in thousands of tanks, across years of industrialized warfare that treated human beings as components, useful, expendable, and ultimately replaceable. We remember the battles. We remember the statistics. We remember the ultimate victory. We rarely remember the cost measured not in lives lost, but in lives ruined. Men who survived physically but died psychologically, who carried the war inside their heads for decades, who never escaped the small steel compartments where they learned that they were alone, expendable, and valued only for their ability to keep machines moving. That is Yuri Sokolov's legacy. Not heroism, not glory,